Hello everyone, and welcome to a segment that I'm going to entitle The Legend of Zelda: Food for Thought. The idea of this video is going to be address some things that I feel are important in Zelda timeline discussion, and things that I was originally going to include in the big podcast that I spoke of that would be run by Tredge 2097. However, given that it's been over a year since I made that announcement, and the fact that I'm going to be leaving for the Air Force soon, I decided I couldn't wait anymore and I wanted to air out all of the compilation of ideas and theories from a number of different sources that I've gathered together. This isn't so much a timeline video as it is an elaboration of what goes into the thought process of myself and my peers. But the one that I'm going to refer to most is Tredge 2097. The reasoning for this is that his timeline, I feel, is the absolute best from the point of view of a linearist. While I'm a splittist and I don't personally believe in a linear timeline myself, I do see a lot of the ideas and thoughts he's strung together. This video isn't made to debunk his theory or the theories of others, so much as it is to inform and possibly expand on ideas that some people haven't thought of. That being said, I'd advise you to get a snack or take a bathroom break before continuing, because this is probably going to be a really long video. And if you're only interested in the bare bones parts of timeline theory, this probably isn't for you. First off, I'm going to discuss the one theory that I do want to debunk, and that's the literal legend theory. First off, let me say that a literal legend of Zelda implies that each game is a retelling of the same story over and over, with some distortions in character roles, story elements, and conflicts, but the basic idea remains the same. A boy named Link travels through a land in peril and saves its people, and in many versions, its princess from an evil that's plaguing it. Now, if the games were much simpler, with less story emphasis, much like Mario, I'd definitely be on the bandwagon and I'd support this idea, and just say, okay, you're thinking too hard about everything. But that's simply not the case. Just judging from what we know from evidence in the games themselves, we know there is a timeline of sorts that looks like this. Skyward Sword, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, connected in some form to the Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, and Spirit Tracks. There's other smaller timelines that exist within the series as well. Minish Cap, Four Swords, and Four Swords Adventures are a part of their own timeline, not taking into account any games that may or may not be in between them if they don't all take place sequentially. The Legend of Zelda to Adventure of Link is the earliest bridge in the series, and also either of the Oracle games are back-to-back as well. This is something that all but a few theorists will unanimously agree on, and right there we already have a number of actual proven timelines in the Legend of Zelda series. But there's also more subtle traces of timeline theory that don't relate directly to some games, but they do affect the big picture overall. The big example is the forging of the Master Sword that we're going to see soon in Skyward Sword. This, by default, pushes all other Zelda games that have any relation whatsoever to the Master Sword behind it. This process of elimination is what we can use to place many of the games in a relative order of some kind. To start off, the bare-bones timeline theory that anyone will have starts with Skyward Sword, the events of the Master Sword's creation. This follows with the next game to feature the Master Sword, which nearly everyone will argue is Ocarina of Time. What also happens here is that we see what's presumably the first appearance of Ganondorf. We've also been given some official information on this. It's said that Ganondorf's presence in Hyrule during the events of OOT will be alluded to sometime during the story of Skyward Sword, so assuming this holds true, Ganondorf's first official appearance in the series is Ocarina of Time. Next, OOT's obvious direct sequel, Majora's Mask. Following that is the game that makes the most mention of the events of Ocarina of Time, that being the Wind Waker. Next up is Phantom Hourglass, then Spirit Tracks. The big issues come from interpreting any timeline splits or chronological placement of the other games. Some believe the timeline is linear, others believe it is split at OOT, but the basic idea of this line of games is constant throughout any timeline theory. Now to start off with, I'm going to discuss some discrepancies for each school of thought. The timeline becomes most difficult to place in a linear fashion due to a number of different elements throughout the series that contradict other events that occur. The most common one is that Twilight Princess makes a lot of references to the Hero of Time. along with many similarities in geography and things appearing as if the adult ending of OOT is completely independent from it. Both Wind Waker and Twilight Princess are the only games barring direct sequels that refer to a past hero, and both of them make very heavy mention of the Hero of Time, or Link from Ocarina of Time. Now, it's not an absolute statement, but the reasonable conclusion that we could draw from this is that they are the games that take place closest to OOT. Certainly that was also the official intent by the designers. The problem that arises from this is that if it is true, Twilight Princess would have to take place before Wind Waker in a linear timeline. But this also causes problems, most notably being that Ganondorf dies at the end of Twilight Princess, yet the Ganondorf from Wind Waker is obviously the same one from OOT's ceiling. At the same time, there is no evidence whatsoever of the flood existing in the world prior to Twilight Princess. There's also some problems that occur with split timeline discussions, many of which have been brought up by TrueEdge, but I'll briefly summarize by saying that if we take the ending of OOT at face value, Link has taken the Triforce of Courage back to the past with him. Now, that's not to say that there aren't theories that can attempt to patch this up. If you've watched any of my split timeline retrospective, you'll see that I've put my 2 cents in on the subject. Another common argument is that the events of the Wind Waker will often make reference to the events of Majora's Mask, which, according to split theory, is on the other side of the split. There's also a few other issues, one which I can't verify myself. The one that's been mentioned to me by many people through private messages is the fact that the King of Red Lions has a speech, which in the original Japanese script is much more direct and to the point than was translated to us. In our script, the King of the Red Lions claims that the Hero of Time went away on another adventure and so could not stop Ganon when the seal broke. But in the original Japanese, he's apparently saying that the Hero of Time went back to his original era. If this direct translation is legitimate and not just made up by somebody, this certainly says that Wind Waker was designed with a split timeline in mind, because it would take place opposite Majora's Mask. Unfortunately, as of now, and probably for the remainder of my life, I can't read Japanese text, so I'd need someone who can verify this for me. But it's certainly something I feel is important in timeline discussion, and it's a bit frustrating when you consider that we kind of get stiffed by things that are lost in translation. Now that I'm done with discrepancies with both linear and split timeline, I'm going to discuss some miscellaneous information that needs to be said to help future timeline theories along, and things to take into account if you form your own theory. The first important thing to discuss with timeline theory is the state of Ganondorf, the Master Sword, and the Triforce. The reason why is that these are the 3 constants throughout the series. There's only one Master Sword, only one Triforce, and many people will say that there's only one, or at the very most, very few Ganondorfs. Conversely, there's many Links, many Zeldas, many Impas, and many of any other character or landmark throughout the series. These also reinforce the general order that I discussed earlier. Since Skyward Sword introduces the Master Sword, it quite clearly takes place before any of the games that have it. Assuming it also references Ganondorf, the very next game would be OOT, which is his first chronological entry into the storyline. After Majora's Mask, which is its direct sequel, next up would be Wind Waker, which features the same Ganondorf, and the Triforce is in the same state we left it in OOT. Wind Waker ends, then all of its direct sequels leading up to Spirit Tracks take place. During this time, the Master Sword is lost under the Sea of Hyrule, and unless there's some kind of in-game entry stating otherwise, I don't subscribe to the theory that it can simply be brought back. Now, it worked for TrueEdge's argument, but I simply don't see it. However, I'm not going to say that it's impossible, and even though I don't like the idea myself, I'm going to explain one way, possibly the only way, that it could work when it comes to in-game evidence. And it actually works quite well with TrueEdge's chronology that he presented for his timeline. The major game that he places after the Wind Waker is the original Legend of Zelda. The one ambiguous feature of this game is the magical sword. Many people think this is the Master Sword, Many people think it isn't. I don't. But the only way that the Master Sword could be reintroduced to the timeline is if it were. Personally, I feel it's a bit overreaching, simply because you get it in a cave from some random dude, but it's the only piece of in-game evidence of any kind that the Master Sword could have been recovered after Wind Waker's flood in the linear timeline. The one thing that could fix this mix-up, though, is the stateside remake of the original game, to put this issue to rest once and for all, but the odds of us getting it are questionable at the very best. Another important issue comes up when we take into account the Temple of Time and its relation to the Lost Woods. Originally in OOT, there's nothing connecting these two, but this changes in Twilight Princess. It's suggested that the location of the Temple of Time was moved to the forest, which is supported by the deteriorating ruins of the once complete structure. We're left to assume that this deterioration continues until A Link to the Past, where everything recognizable about the old Temple of Time is long gone, but it still requires the same tests of courage and virtue from the past games in order to wield it. The reason why it was moved is anyone's guess, but the most logical reasoning would be to keep it and the portal to the Sacred Realm safe from anyone who sought to use them for evil. Now, this is where a lot more theorizing comes into play when taking into account the other games that haven't been mentioned in my main timeline discussion yet, namely the 2D games. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to assume that you subscribe to a split timeline, because a lot more work and out-of-game thinking must be done to put it into a linear perspective. And when putting a timeline theory together, you want to keep as few theories as possible and as much evidence as possible. The reason why the 2D games are so difficult to place is that many are missing one or more of the three constants I spoke of earlier. Some, in the case of the Minish Cap and Link's Awakening, are missing all three constants. In other cases, the games might have Ganondorf, the Triforce, and the Master Sword, but they're so self-contained with their own backstory and ending that placing them becomes a real challenge, as is the case of A Link to the Past. I'm going to go down the line in terms of when each game was released and discuss where things should be placed due to the game's three constants and relative geography. Let's start with The Legend of Zelda. Prior to the game's introduction, Ganon had apparently stolen the Triforce of Power and sought to do the same for Zelda's Triforce of Wisdom before she shattered it into 8 pieces. We aren't certain of whether or not the Triforce had been at rest or in the possession of the royal family, but given the backstory of Adventure of Link and the Triforce of Courage, we can assume that it was in the hands of the royal family. I'm not going to discuss a lot of the specifics as I had gone over that in my big timeline retrospective, but for the sake of simplicity, we have Ganon, we have the Triforce, and unless we're told the contrary, no Master Sword. So this game could take place after the era of Spirit Tracks, or sometime after A Link to the Past if we're led to believe that the Triforce came to rest in the Sacred Realm again after Twilight Princess. Now, I'm going to very quickly discuss why it can take place on the right side of the timeline, and that's due to the Triforce of Courage, as seen in Adventure of Link. The so-called original Zelda was put to sleep shortly before the Triforce of Courage was sealed away for all time in the Great Palace prior to Adventure of Link. In fact, we know it can't be the original Zelda because Ocarina of Time marks the first chronological use of both the Triforce and Ganon. So no game that uses the Triforce of Courage in any way could take place between her being put to sleep and the Adventure of Link. So I consider this supposed original Zelda to simply be another one of the large line of Zeldas before and after her. And that's all I'm going to say on that subject. Next up, A Link to the Past. This game, as I mentioned before, features all of the big three constants, but despite this, the game and its backstory are very self-contained. So it would take place after a time that the Triforce had been reset in the Sacred Realm, but it would be placed after Twilight Princess as well, due to the presence of the Pedestal of Time being in the Lost Woods. This one's actually pretty easy to place, and while I don't do so myself, the two original Zelda games could take place after this. The game that follows is Link's Awakening. Shigeru Miyamoto himself has admitted that it's not very clear where Link's Awakening takes place, and I agree wholeheartedly. The only thing that could connect it in any way to A Link to the Past is a very brief statement in the English manual, which I question to a very large extent. It could take place any time after a Link has dealt with the challenges of a prior journey. I simply place it after the Oracles due to the smooth transition that ending offers. Speaking of the Oracles, those are the next games to place. These games have all of the big three, but I'll discuss the presence of the Master Sword in a second. The Triforce is at rest in Hyrule Castle at the beginning of this journey, and Ganon is seemingly long dead. We also know that it must take place on the child timeline due to the presence of Twin Rova, who we offed in the adult timeline. The only time the whole Triforce has been in the possession of Link, the royal family, or any combination thereof is after A Link to the Past and after the 8-bit games. Now, if you have those games after A Link to the Past, the Oracles could be in between A Link to the Past and the first Zelda game, or after the end of the two originals. Since I placed the originals on the other side of the timeline though, and I've gone in depth many times as to why I do so, they would take place after A Link to the Past, and then we'd place Link's Awakening after them. To briefly mention the presence of the Master Sword, while this doesn't change my position of the game's placement, I question the canonical use of the weapon. It's given none of the mystique and lore that it has everywhere else in the series, as the Oracle games have the Noble Sword. The Master Sword seems to merely be an upgrade for player convenience and little more. It's really difficult to tell given the use of the password system and if any of the upgrades you get with the passwords are considered canon or not. Regardless, this is where I place them. The last games, and most confusing of all to discuss, are the Four Swords games. The reason why is that these games, with the exception of Ganon and Four Swords Adventures, have none of the three constants, and only make brief mentions of the Triforce, alluding to them the same way that the Wind Waker did. Now, if what we're assuming about Skyward Sword holds true, and it does in fact closely precede the Hyrulean Civil War, this gives little to no time for any game to take place in between them, and for the first time, I'm moving the Four Swords games around. While they don't have to take place consecutively as they're ridiculously self-contained, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to place them as such. The question, of course, is where they take place. The answer is two options with this timeline mold in mind. It could take place in between Twilight Princess and A Link to the Past, due to the fact that Four Swords Adventures marks the Trident of Power coming into Ganon's possession, and would transition nicely into A Link to the Past. There's also a number of other similarities between Four Swords Adventures and A Link to the Past that have been mentioned by many other theorists besides me. Another place it could go is after Spirit Tracks and between the original games. The reasoning behind this is in Minish Cap, the mention of the Triforce as the Triumph Forks, which is the name it's often referred to in the era of the Wind Waker. The ending of Four Swords Adventures could also be a good transition into my placement of the original games, with Ganon escaping his prison of the Four Sword and claiming the Triforce of Power, but this is merely speculation. So in making a rough timeline for myself with all of this in mind, here's how I now place them. Skyward Sword, Ocarina of Time, then the timeline splits. On the child timeline we have Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, then the entire Four Swords series, followed by A Link to the Past, the Oracle games, and lastly Link's Awakening. On the adult side of the timeline we have the Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks, and again the Four Swords series. This ends with Legend of Zelda, and finally Adventure of Link. While I would like to be conclusive and give a definite location for my placement of the Four Swords games, as I've mentioned, they could take place at either location and could have games between them as well. For me to make a definite choice as to where to put them would literally be a coin flip, so I'm going to have them on both sides and let you choose whichever you like. This is just a quick little outline of how you go about connecting these games together, and while I could have gone on for another hour like I did in my timeline retrospective, I wanted to keep it brief and easy to follow for people who may be new to coming up with their own theories. While I do hope to outline all of these things and more in the future with my fellow timeline theorist if this podcast does come to fruition, I wanted to get the main points and changes out of the way before I left for a while. Thanks for watching, and I hope everyone enjoyed this little food for thought. Have a good day, everybody.